Hello, 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 and welcome. Now, this week we're going to be doing a little bit more gouache, and I've started a series of ducklings, and what I've done is I've bought a pack of 100 postcards from Pantone. Recently, I think it was last year, 2020, maybe it was the year before, but anyway, recently there was a challenge, a 100-day challenge, where you paint a painting each day for 100 days on the Pantone postcards. I'm not doing all that. I'm not doing all that. But I am going to use those postcards since they're small to see what I can do with gouache, practice my gouache, and I'm going to take you along with me because hopefully as I learn, you will learn, and that will be great for both of us. So this is duckling number 1. Let's just go ahead and get started. If we haven't met, I'm Viv. This is Art with Viv, and let's go to the studio. I've taken my Pantone swatch card. Well, it's a postcard. You can get them in a pack of 100. And this one is faded denim. The idea behind the whole Pantone challenge is to use the color of the swatch somewhere in your painting. I'm just using it as my background for this one. And the first thing I've done with my little duckling is I am blocking in all of the dark colors first, the darkest darks first. Now, I know with gouache, conventional wisdom is you paint light to dark, which means you paint your light colors and then your dark colors last because it's so much easier to paint a dark color over a light color. But I'm not conventional and I don't know how much wisdom I have, but I'm going to paint my lightest colors last. That's going to be my last layer. And the reason that I can get away with doing that is simple. You can paint light colors over gouache, light colors over darker colors, but the trick is you have to make sure that that layer is completely dry before you come back over with a lighter color onto a darker color. If it is too wet, they will meld together, they will blend together. You don't want that. You don't want that muddy look. So the best thing is to do is wait for that dark layer to dry completely before you come back in and try to paint lighter over it. Now I'm just blocking in my yellows. I'm just putting in a few of the lighter highlights too as we go. Also, another thing, you want to paint from thin to thick. So your first layers that you put down should have a little more water. They should be a little bit thinner. And as you build up, you should put thicker paint on top, creamier paint as you go through the layers, but paint thin to thick. Now I'm just going ahead, getting in all these colors, just sort of blocked in the basic shapes for the basic colors, and where it's lighter, I'm putting in those shapes with the lighter colors. I'm using a limited palette, and if you want to have a full supply list along with the outline drawing and along with a color mixing guide, reference photo, then you might want to join my Patreon. It's only $5 a month and you'll get all those things as well as a full-length video that walks you step through step. It won't be a speeded up video like this one. My Patreon members at the $5 level, they get a full-length video with step-by-step instructions along with the supply list, an outline drawing traceable, and the color guide. So you might want, if you're interested in that, I'll link it below and you can check that out. So here we go now. We are still getting in the darker colors. Once you get those in, then I'm starting on the beak. Now this duck's beak, it is the most complicated part of the duck. It has a lot of highlights, it has a lot of shadows, it has a lot of colors that sort of change from one into another. It's sort of a grayish black that blends into an orange, into a peach. So it is the most complicated, so I'm being very careful when I do this beak. I'm really paying attention to the shapes of each color, where they're located, make sure I'm putting them in the right spot, make sure that they are as light or as dark as they need to be, and of course the correct color. I'm also making sure that I blend those in together where it needs to be blended in. And the reason I'm doing ducklings, a series of ducklings, is because Easter is at the end of this month. And even though ducklings really don't have anything to do with Easter, sometimes a lot of us associate ducklings with Easter. because it's spring. That's when a lot of the ducklings hatch. That's when a lot of chicks hatch. A lot of baby bunnies are born. So those things are sometimes associated with Easter, new life, new beginnings. So that is why I am doing ducks, and I just love ducks. And it's my painting. I'm going to paint what I want to. You paint what you want to. That's how it works. That's the whole point of art, is to paint what you love, paint what you want, and enjoy the process. So I'm really learning a lot with this gouache. And I'm also pushing the envelope by painting light over dark, even though everyone says no, paint light to dark, put your light colors first and then come back over them with your dark colors. And I get it. It is so much easier to paint a dark color over a light color, but I'm not doing that. I'm doing it the way that I want to. And it's working for me. And as long as you abide by that rule, that you let that gouache dry completely before you come back over it, it'll be fine. Now you can also use acrylic as the underlayer if you want to. I don't want to, because sometimes acrylic, it dries a little bit shiny. I don't like that shiny look. You could also use acrylic gouache, which is sort of a gouache, but it's really acrylic. It's more like a flat acrylic paint. If I was going to do that, I'd just use acrylic paint. So I'm not interested in learning acrylic gouache, or however they call it, which is actually just a flat acrylic paint, in my opinion. I'm just going to stick with the traditional gouache and push the boundaries of what it is capable of and what I'm capable of. Now I might mix my gouache with some watercolor. I think that would be a good idea. A lot of people mix their acrylics with gouache. Like I said, I don't really like traditional acrylics with gouache because acrylics are plastic and they have a tendency to dry a little bit shiny, and I just don't like that shiny look. I really like the flat look of the gouache for some reason. Another thing, these postcards, these Pantone postcards, let me give you a little tip here. The surface is shiny, it is slick. So in order to get my gouache to stick to this postcard, I took some clear gesso, and I did 2 coats of clear gesso over that card, so you can still see the color through it, but it gives a surface that the gouache will stick through to, And if you don't have clear gesso, that's fine. You can use Mod Podge. You can use a matte Mod Podge. I wouldn't suggest using the shiny Mod Podge because you don't want that, unless you want a shiny background. I wouldn't. But the matte Mod Podge, you can use that in place of clear acrylic. It works just as well. It'll hold that gouache right to the surface. It gets rid of that shininess. So that's just a little tip for you. Instead of trying to paint directly onto that slick surface of Pantone postcards or any surface, anytime you have a slick surface, then I suggest use a little bit of clear gesso if you're going to paint over it with gouache. So I'm just moving on, getting all these little shapes and things in on that beak. When I got that finished, now I am coming back with some lighter colors over my darker colors. But I'm also being careful to make sure that I let those darker colors that I painted first shine through, so that we get a variation and some depth in there with that texture. And I'm just taking some really pale yellow now and just adding some little fuzzes around the edge, just along the top, across some of that darker solid color, and that sort of wakes it up. It starts giving it more dimension, and it helps with the realism. It makes it look a little more realistic instead of that just flat color, that flat one-tone brown on his forehead there. So that helps with that, and that's what we're doing. And I'm being really light with my touch because, again, I do not want to reactivate that dark brown when I go over it, because I don't want my strokes to look muddy. I don't want my colors to get mixed and blend in. I'm not as careful when I'm doing yellows over yellows. It's okay if that base reactivates and mixes a little bit with my second coat of yellow, even if they're two different shades. That's fine. That doesn't bother me. But when I'm working with a really pale color over one of those darker colors, that's when I'm using my light touch and really being careful with not reactivating that darker color so that it doesn't just blur into nothingness or grayness or muddiness. We want those light strokes to show. We want them to shine. And we're going to be careful doing that. And now I'm just adding lots of tiny little brush strokes. I'm using a detail brush. It's actually made for either watercolor or acrylic paint, but I'm using it for my gouache. And it is a tiny golden maple detail brush. I think it's a size 2 or a size 1. It's really small. And just getting in those little tiny brush marks to make it look like feathers. And just to give it some texture. It's really pretty. I like the way this little duck is coming out. As you see, I've used whole bean gouache. I just bought a set, and it doesn't have a lot of colors, but I did just limit this palette to yellow and brown, and with a little bit of deep ultramarine in the palette that I used for this duck. And that is another good suggestion. When you're first starting out with gouache or any paint, any colors, try to limit your palette. That teaches you, 1, how to mix colors to get the colors that you need. 2, you don't get overwhelmed with having so many color choices. And at the end, you'll have a unified painting because you've used the same colors. It looks more unified. It looks more congruent is what I'm going to say. I don't think that's the right word, but you get the meaning. It's just overall more intentional and pretty, and there's less room for error or putting in colors that will jolt you because you're working with that few limited palette that's just a few little colors. So we don't like being jolted sometimes, unless that's what you're going for. Unless you're going for something emotional in your paintings, then you might want, a little bit of color jolt in them. I'm just going for a cute little duck. I'm just trying to practice my gouache. I'm using a small little card to do it, just to practice my technique, see how it works, see what I can get away with and how much I can push that envelope. And so far, I really like how this is coming out. I think I'm doing an okay job. I like my little cute little Easter duck. I think I'm going to name him Henry. He looks like a Henry to me. Little Henry the duck. And he is a fluffy duck. So I'm still just adding more lighter layers, letting those darker layers shine through in between my brush strokes. And that just gives it texture and depth. Makes it look a little more realistic. And I'm also adding some of that really bright yellow on top, just in some spots, and that just sort of gives it a little pop, a little pizzazz. I really like it. It makes it almost glow in some areas with that really deep yellow. And then in some areas where it may be gotten a little too flat or a little too solid, I'm coming back in with some of my darker paint to break those areas up that have become a little bit too solid or a little bit too flat. But again, I'm still letting some of that lighter shine through, even though I'm putting darker on top of it. And there we go. Let's see what we got. Let's take the tape off. I think it is successful. Thank you for watching. Don't forget, you can get all of that stuff on my Patreon for $5 a month. It's a great deal, and I'll link it below. And I hope you have success with all of your artistic endeavors.